This is your fair warning that I'm going to make you work just a little bit this morning. You only have to be awake for those parts of the sermon. You can doze off for the rest. So we're going to start here. Because today we're talking about love. And that's the first thing I want you to do. I want you to say the word love with me. That's an easy one, right? So, 1, 2, 3, love. Excellent. You know, our series is about our identity as Christians. In our Wesleyan tradition, our identity is Methodist, and all great organizations know their purpose. They know their identities. And so that's really what we're talking about today. What are we talking about? What's our word? 1, 2, 3. There we go. You guys actually have that. We could probably just go to the offering at this point. Everything else just kind of explains that. You know, our particular tradition within the Christian faith is based on a message of love and grace. It's in Charles Wesley's hymns, one of which we sang this morning. It's in the sermons and journals that John Wesley published. It's how they organized their movement into small groups for support and accountability. And what were they being held accountable for? For love. It's how they arranged their lives. Now, all churches talk about love and grace. We haven't cornered the market on those ideas in the Christian faith. It's not just ours, of course, but we do talk about it a lot. And we emphasize it, perhaps more than any other tradition, and that is what makes us unique. Because for the Wesleys and for the early Methodists, it wasn't just talk. They didn't just talk a good game about love and grace. They made it real. They put it into action every single day. You know, I once heard a church consultant who, before she would go to meet with a congregation, she would send one of her staff to visit the congregation on a Sunday morning, posing as a first-time guest. Call them a mystery guest, perhaps. The visitor would experience that church as a first-timer from the parking lot through the postlude. And then later, when she would go to meet with the church leaders and they would talk about their church, they of course said, well, we're a very friendly church. We're very, very welcoming. Because you know why? Because every single church says that about themselves. You'll never go to a church and say, no, we're really grumpy and closed off and we hate when people come to visit. They always say they're friendly and welcoming. We say we're friendly and welcoming. And then the consultant would share the results of their visitors' actual experience. And sometimes it was good. Sometimes she was like, you're absolutely right. You do a lot of wonderful things. But as you can imagine, there were quite a number of times where there was one of those sort of reality surfacing conversations, the difference between perception and reality. How do you think Wesley would do if we brought in that consultant? Makes you think a little bit. Because we too have to talk the talk, yes, but we also have to walk the walk when it comes to love and grace. In Luke 15, the story we know so well, Jesus is telling us a story about that love. A father with 2 sons. The youngest is a prodigal son. And do you know what prodigal means? I ask that because I'll be honest, I grew up in the church. This is one of my favorite parables. I never really knew what prodigal meant. I just assumed it meant wayward or rebel or something like that. I didn't bother to look it up because you never use that word anywhere else. At least I don't. But I did look it up at some point. There's actually 2 definitions. The first is wastefully extravagant. That makes some sense. But it can also mean to have or to give something on a lavish scale. There's some overlap in those two. Wastefully extravagant, or to have or give something on a lavish scale. Which definition do you think fits that youngest son? I mean, it's obvious from the story, right? I mean, he was wastefully extravagant. He goes to his father and says, hey, since you're not dead yet, I'd like my inheritance. Which is kind of insulting. I can't imagine saying that to my parents. It's kind of the equivalent of saying, I wish you were dead, but since you're not, can I have the cash anyway? And remarkably, the father says, okay. And the younger son takes it. As we know, he wastes it. He squanders it. He is wastefully extravagant. He misuses it, and it all disappears. And then the guy hits bottom. He ends up taking a job feeding pigs. Now, Jesus was Jewish. All of Jesus' followers were Jewish. When they heard this story about him feeding the pigs, pigs are considered unclean animals in that tradition. And so Jesus just adding that little detail into the story. You can imagine they probably winced. He didn't say, oh, the guy hit rock bottom. It was painfully obvious to all of them. He couldn't sink any lower. But then we're told he comes to his senses. He considers the way that his father treats even his lowliest servant, that his dad is decent and treats everybody well, and he realizes that he's better off being a servant on the estate than being almost anywhere else. And he knows he doesn't deserve a place there. But it's the only place he still has even a little bit of hope. And so he figures out what he's going to say, he rehearses it, and he heads back home. Now there are two gestures that are important to get right to really understand the rest of this story. Because remember, actions speak louder than words. It's not what you say, but what you do that people remember. And so I'm going to make you do these gestures. I told you it was going to work. You can wake up now. The first gesture is this one. Everybody do this with me. Arms wide open. Very, very good. If you got some shoulder problems, feel free to not use one hand. It's fine. That's how the father receives the prodigal son. You can put your hands down if you want. You're welcome to leave them up. We'll go a little Pentecostal today. That's fine. The father saw his son a long way off, which means he was looking for him. It was moved with compassion. He ran to his son with arms wide open and embraced him. This wide and this long embrace, and he cuts off his son's woe is me speech, and he calls for the best robe to be put on his shoulders. The signet ring that signifies his place in the family was put on his hand, and he calls for this great celebration. The son who was dead has come back to life. He was lost. He is found. That wide embrace wasn't just that first hug, but he continued to surround this younger son with acceptance. That's how the first gesture goes. But here's the second gesture. You can do this one with me too. It's a little bit easier. Just sort of cross your arms. If you want to scowl, you're more than welcome. I'm used to it by now. This is how the older son responds. The older son who never left home, the one who's dutiful and responsible, his actions speak louder than words too. He is furious when he hears what's going on. He's not mad at his brother, maybe a little bit, but his anger is directed at his father because of his father's love and his compassion. There's an author who insightfully says that both sons in the story suffer the problem of alienation from their father. The younger son, it's obvious, he does a terrible thing, asked for the inheritance before it was owed and then squandered it all. But the other brother also wants the money too. He's just willing to wait for it. The older brother doesn't have any more relationship with his father than the younger brother did. It just looks better the way he did it. It appears good. But it's clear in this story he never really understands what his father is about. Even when his father pleads with his older son, explains why he was doing what he was doing. You know, you're always with me. All I have is yours. Nothing has been taken from you, right? It's almost like the older brother acted like something was taken from him, that this part, he was so incredulous. But nothing's been taken from you. But we have to celebrate. Your brother who was dead and is alive, he was lost and is now found, but the older brother just doesn't get it. This younger brother comes home and his father's arms are wide open. The other brother closes his, and he turns his back. He was disgusted by a display of acceptance and affection. This arms crossed, it's a posture of judgment. It's a failure of love. And you know, in our own lives, when we respond to others with anger or with fear instead of with empathy or compassion, that's a failure of love on our part too. There was another sermon I heard that said there were actually two prodigals in this story. Because remember those two definitions. The prodigal son wasted his fortune, that wasteful extravagance, that's one definition. But the father becomes prodigal as well from that other definition. One who has or gives something on a lavish scale. Father's love, that's a prodigal love. It's not wasteful, it is just lavishly shared. And we know, of course, Jesus is using this parable to tell us something about the character of God. Jesus is saying, you want to know what God is like? God's like a parent who throws his arms wide open to embrace a child who had walked away from him. That's who God is. And this parable assures us that we are loved by a God who is recklessly extravagant with love, who runs to meet us, who even seeks us out, that reminds us that we are children of God no matter what, and that we are draped in that robe of mercy and wear a seal of God's grace and acceptance. That's such good news to hear. But this parable is also a warning to us about how quickly we can turn on one another. As much as we celebrate God's love for us, how quickly are we to close ourselves off as we turn away in anger or we hide from fear rather than to run towards one another with love and acceptance. I mean, God's been so generous to all of us, and all we're being asked to do is come to a party that we didn't even plan to begin with. Just come to the party and be with all the other people God's accepted and loved. And I think that's why we Methodists focus so much on love and grace. Maybe it's because we just love a party, I don't know. But I think that's why it's the foundation of our theology. If those who are so skeptical of the church, because they see far more of this from Christians and far less of this. But if we reverse that and they saw a whole lot more of arms wide open, I think we might find a few more folks willing to come to the party too. We can understand that the gracious love of God is the character of God. And if we understand that and accept that, it will have real impact on how we live and the words that we say and the things that we do. And when we do find ourselves reacting with anger and fear, because that's sometimes a natural response, we can stop ourselves and we can say, that's one of God's children. And if I cross my arms and if I turn my back, I'm going to be missing the points. And then I'm going to be missing the party. What Wesley was trying to do in his Methodist movement was simply get the actions aligned with our beliefs about God's love. At the very beginning of the Wesleyan revival, 1739, John Wesley is in and around Bristol, England. Wesley's movement had met resistance in a lot of the churches. Normally he'd go to these towns, he'd get to preach from the pulpit at the local parish church, but he was no longer invited to preach in those pulpits. And so a friend of his from his Oxford days, one who was even a more famous preacher than Wesley was at that time, George Whitefield, he invited Wesley to preach out in the open air. You're not allowed in the churches? Go out into the fields, go to the public square, preach there. And Wesley was really clear, even in his own journals, that's not something I want to do. I only preach from the pulpit. It's dignified, it's proper, it's how things are done. He considered field preaching to be degrading. But on April 2nd, 1739, he changed his mind. And this is one of his more famous journal entries. He wrote, "At 4 p.m, I submitted to be more vile." This is not permission for you to be more vile. Don't take that the wrong way. I submitted to be more vile, though, in his mind. And he said, "I proclaimed in the highways the glad tidings of salvation." Years later, they made a etching of this scene of John preaching out in the fields that very first time. And do you want to know what he's doing with his hands? He's preaching. He's preaching about God's love. His arms are wide open, and the people who gathered around to hear Wesley preach that day and the days that followed weren't the types that were usually in church, often because they simply weren't welcome there. They were poor, or they were filthy from the coal mines. Many were addicted to rum or gin. They had spent time in debtors' prisons and in poor houses, and they didn't have their act together in any way. But there was Wesley in the open fields telling them about a God who embraces widely, whose love extends to each one of them. Others had made them feel like complete losers. But they had been judged. They had been pushed aside. They had been told to know your place. They had been filled with despair, with no hope for a better life. And Wesley told them that they were a beloved child of God, and told them about a God who runs to meet them, to embrace them. And he said, you know what? My Methodist societies will embrace you too. And then together we can work on putting our lives back together. That's why the Wesleyan movement caught fire in England. That's why it spread to be the largest Protestant religious group in less than a century. Because they didn't just meet for worship and prayer and singing. They opened medical clinics, and they taught money management, and they helped keep people sober and gainfully employed, and they worked together to reform the debtor prison laws to be more just. They preached God's love, and then they made it real in their communities of faith. Because Wesley didn't want Methodists to be Christian in name only. He wanted a movement that practiced love so fully that they couldn't help but see God's love in action. And that's what it means to be a Methodist. We embrace widely. We pay attention to those who have been pushed aside, whether they're struggling with addiction like those that Wesley served, or whether they're facing poverty. We embrace widely women whose voices have been diminished, if not outright silenced, in other churches and in other communities. We embrace widely our LGBTQ siblings who've been told by far too many that they don't belong in God's family. But we tell another story, a story about a father who runs to embrace widely. We pay attention to those who have only ever seen Christians with their arms crossed and their backs turned. We tell a different story. And we just don't tell that story. We open our arms wide open too. And we throw a party. And we live that story together. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen.